The year is 1720. A village in the English countryside, somewhere between Leeds and York. The morning begins not with an alarm, but with light. Pale, grey, soft light, pushing through the cracks of a timber-framed cottage. A woman rises before dawn, her hands already knowing what to do before her eyes fully open. She stirs the embers. She sets the bread. Outside, her husband is already in the field, moving through rows of barley with the steady, the unhurried rhythm of a man who has done this every morning of his life, as his father did, and his grandfather before that. This is England in the early 18th century, and it is, by almost every measure, a quiet place. Not peaceful. Quiet is not the same as peaceful. Harvests fail. Children die young. A cold winter can kill a family slowly, without drama, without anyone writing it down. Life here is hard in the way that all pre-industrial life is hard. It bends the body, shortens the years, asks everything and promises little. But it has a rhythm, and that rhythm, for all its cruelty, is human in scale. In the villages, the blacksmith knows every family by name. The weaver sits at her loom, producing cloth at a rate of perhaps 2 yards per hour, by hand, by feel, by memory, passed down through generations. A single bolt of fabric might take a week to complete. A single pair of shoes might last a decade. Nothing is wasted because nothing can be replaced easily. The world moves at the speed of muscle and wind and water. In 1720, England has a population of roughly 5.5 million people. About 80% of them live in the countryside. The biggest city, London, holds perhaps 600,000 souls, enormous by the standards of the time, but nothing, absolutely nothing compared to what it is about to become. The economy runs on land and labor and the slow accumulation of seasons. Merchants trade wool. Farmers tithe to landlords who have held their estates for generations. The church marks the calendar. The calendar marks the year. The year marks a life. There is beauty in this world, real, genuine beauty. A beauty that people who will come later, who will live under smoke and gaslight and the grinding of iron wheels, will ache for and write poems about and never quite be able to describe. But there is also a ceiling, a fixed limit. A young man born into a weaving family will die in a weaving family. A girl born into poverty has almost no path out of it. The world is stable because it is fixed, and fixed worlds, in the long story of human civilization, never stay fixed forever. Somewhere in Scotland, in 1736, a boy is born. His name is James Watt. He is small, sickly, curious, the kind of child who takes things apart to see how they work. He will not farm. He will not weave. He will not inherit a field. He will change everything. But in 1720, nobody knows that yet. The bread rises, the barley sways. The blacksmith's hammer falls once, twice, steady as a heartbeat. It is the last quiet morning the world will ever know. The steam engine did not appear out of nowhere. It was born from frustration, from the very specific, very expensive problem of water flooding coal mines deep in the English earth. By the early 1700s, mining operations across England and Wales had hit a wall. They had found coal, enormous quantities of it, but the deeper they dug, the more water seeped in. Men with buckets and hand pumps were losing the battle. Thomas Newcomen built the first practical steam-powered pump in 1712. It was massive, inefficient, and it consumed coal at a rate that made it barely worth running. But it worked. And it proved something that would take decades to fully understand. Fire could do the work of 100 men. James Watt was 28 years old when he first examined a model of Newcomen's engine. It was 1764. He was a mathematical instrument maker at the University of Glasgow, precise, methodical, and immediately troubled by what he saw. The engine was wasting energy, enormous amounts of it. Watt could see exactly why. He spent the next 2 years thinking about almost nothing else. He walked. He calculated. He lost sleep. His wife later said that during those months, he was present in body and absent in mind, always somewhere inside the machine, turning its problems over and over in his thoughts. In 1769, James Watt patented a separate condenser, a single adjustment to the engine's design that made it roughly 4 times more efficient. 4 times. That number sounds technical, but what it meant in practice was this. Suddenly, Steam power was cheap enough to use not just in mines, but anywhere. In textile mills, in iron foundries, in flour mills, on rivers, eventually on roads and rails. The patent was filed quietly. No ceremony, no announcement. Watt wrote to his business partner, Matthew Boulton, that he believed they had something significant. Boulton wrote back with the confidence of a man who understood exactly what he was holding. "I sell here, sir," Boulton told a visitor to his Birmingham manufactory, "that what all the world desires to have, power." By 1780, Boulton and Watt engines were running in factories across England. By 1800, there were more than 500 of them, each one replacing dozens of workers, each one running 24 hours a day without rest, without wages, without complaint. The mills of Manchester began to grow, and then to multiply, and then to dominate the skyline. In 1773, Manchester was a town of roughly 25,000 people. By 1801, it had nearly 90,000. 20 years later, it would cross 150,000. The city was not growing. It was erupting. The factory floor was unlike anything that had existed before. Long, low buildings packed with looms, driven not by human hands, but by steam. The noise was staggering, a constant mechanical roar that workers said you could feel in your chest before you could hear it with your ears. The air was thick with cotton dust. The light was bad, and the hours were long, but the cloth came out faster than any human hand could produce it, cheaper than any human hand could afford to sell it. And that gap between what machines could do and what human hands could do would never close again. It would only widen. They came on foot mostly, from the farms of Yorkshire, from the valleys of Wales, from the villages of Lancashire and Staffordshire and Derbyshire. And they came carrying everything they owned in bundles and carts and on their backs. They came because the land no longer needed them, or rather, because men with money had decided it didn't. The Enclosure Acts had been quietly transforming the English countryside for decades. Common land, the fields and pastures that farming communities had shared for generations, was being fenced off, bought up, converted into private property. A family that had farmed the same plot for 100 years could find, in a single parliamentary decision, that the land they depended on was no longer theirs to use. Between 1760 and 1820, more than 3,000 individual enclosure acts were passed by the British Parliament. Over 6 million acres of common land were transferred to private ownership. 6 million acres. That is larger than the entire country of Wales. In 60 years, that an area that vast was stripped from the hands of the rural poor and handed to landlords and investors. The families who had lived on that land had nowhere to go, except the cities, and so they came. Manchester's population doubled, then doubled again. Birmingham, Leeds, Sheffield, Liverpool, all of them swelling with men and women who had traded the familiar misery of the countryside for the unknown misery of the factory town. What they found was not the fresh start they had imagined, and the tenements were barely standing. A single room might house a family of 8. Entire streets shared a single water pump, the same water that ran near the open sewers. Cholera outbreaks moved through working-class neighborhoods like fire through dry grass. In 1832, a cholera epidemic killed more than 31,000 people in England alone. The children worked. This is the detail that is hardest to absorb, even at a distance of 2 centuries. And children as young as 5 were employed in the cotton mills. They were small enough to crawl under the machines, to clean the parts that adult hands could not reach. They worked shifts of 12, sometimes 14 hours a day. In some mills, they were beaten to stay awake. A parliamentary inquiry in 1832 interviewed a man named Matthew Crabtree, who had begun working in a textile mill at the age of 8. He was asked how early he began work each day. 5 in the morning, he said, until 9 at night. He was asked if he was tired at the end of his shift. Very much so, he said, as if the question barely needed answering. Parliament listened, and then, largely, did nothing. The factory owners argued that the economy depended on the labor, that these families needed the wages, that the alternative was starvation. Some of them believed this. Some of them simply found it convenient to believe. Either way, the machines kept running, the cities kept growing, and the children kept crawling under the looms. Somewhere in those mills, in the noise and the dust and the dark, a new kind of England was being made. Not the England of fields and seasons and village bells, something harder, something louder, something that had never existed before on the face of the earth. On the night of March 11th, 1811, a group of men gathered in the darkness outside Nottingham. They were weavers, skilled craftsmen who had spent years, sometimes decades, on mastering their trade. They could work a stocking frame with speed and precision that was, until recently, considered extraordinary. Now it was considered unnecessary. The new power looms were faster, cheaper, and they did not need skill. The men wore masks. They carried hammers. By morning, 60 stocking frames had been smashed to pieces. They called themselves the Luddites, a name taken from a possibly mythical figure called Ned Ludd, said to have destroyed weaving frames in a fit of rage some years before. Whether Ned Ludd ever existed is uncertain. What is certain is that the movement bearing his name was very real, very organized, and deeply terrifying to the British establishment. Over the next 2 years, Luddite attacks spread across the Midlands and the north of England. Mills were raided. Machinery was destroyed. In some cases, factory owners were threatened directly. One mill owner in Yorkshire, William Horsfall, who had publicly declared he would ride up to his saddle in Luddite blood, was shot dead on his way home from market in April of 1812. The government's response was immediate and overwhelming. Parliament passed the Frame Breaking Act, making the destruction of industrial machinery a capital offence, punishable by death. Then they sent 14,000 soldiers into the north of England, more troops than the Duke of Wellington had under his command in the Iberian Peninsula at that moment. Think about that. Britain was fighting Napoleon across Europe, and it still deployed more soldiers against its own textile workers than against one of the most dangerous military forces in the world. The uprising was crushed. Dozens were hanged. Hundreds were transported to Australia. But the violence had revealed something that factory profits and parliamentary speeches had been successfully concealing. This revolution was not lifting everyone. It was splitting the world in two. On one side, the factory owners, the investors, the shareholders, men who had turned coal and steam and cotton into fortunes that dwarfed anything the old landed gentry had imagined. In 1800, there were perhaps a dozen men in England who could be called industrial millionaires. By 1850, there were hundreds. On the other side, the workers, the people who made everything and owned nothing, the women at the looms, the children under the machines, the men who had once been skilled craftsmen and were now machine minders, performing the same simple motion 800 times a day in a room that smelled of oil and sweat and coal smoke. Friedrich Engels came to Manchester in 1842 as a young German businessman's son. He walked through the working-class districts and was so disturbed by what he saw that he wrote a book about it. He described streets where sunlight never reached, buildings so tightly packed that a single match could have set a whole block burning. He described a city that produced enormous wealth and distributed almost none of it. He shared his findings with a friend named Karl Marx. And the rest, as they say, is its own kind of history. By 1850, the transformation was complete. Or rather, it had passed the point where anyone could reverse it, which is not the same thing as complete. Transformations of this scale are never complete. They continue to echo, for generations, in the bodies and institutions and habits of mind that carry them forward. In 1750, before the revolution had truly begun, Britain produced roughly 2 million tons of coal per year. By 1850, it was producing 49 million. Iron output had increased tenfold. The cotton industry had grown from a modest regional trade to the largest manufacturing sector in the world, with exports reaching every continent. While Britain, in 1850, was the most powerful industrial nation on Earth. Its railways stretched over 6,000 miles of track. Its steam-powered ships were rewriting the maps of global trade. Its factories produced a quarter of the world's manufactured goods. And its people were shorter than they had been a century before. Measurably, statistically shorter. It's because their childhoods had been spent not in open fields with sunlight and physical work and food grown nearby, but in factories and tenements, on diets of bread and weak tea, without fresh air, without adequate sleep. The industrial city was doing something to human bodies that no war had managed. It was shrinking them. Between 1780 and 1830, average male height in industrial British cities fell by nearly an inch. A single inch doesn't sound like much. but it is the biological record of what an entire generation of children endured. It is written in bone, and yet. And here is the part that resists simple judgment. The Industrial Revolution also built the world that eradicated smallpox. That produced antibiotics. That created the infrastructure through which ideas and food and medicine and books could move faster than any civilization had ever managed. And the same machines that crushed the Luddites eventually produced the wealth that funded public libraries, public schools, public health systems. The children who crawled under the looms in 1820 were the grandparents of the generation that built the welfare state. The suffering was real. The legacy was complicated. Both things are true at the same time. By 1900, child labor laws had transformed the factory floor. Working hours had been reduced. The trade unions, born in the same furnace of industrial rage that forged the Luddites, had won real and lasting concessions. The average British worker in 1900 was still exploited by modern standards, but they were less exploited than in 1820, and more than 85% of them could read. In 1720, that number had been closer to 40%. The world before the Industrial Revolution was not a paradise. It was hard and fixed, and often brutal in its own quiet way. And the world after it was also hard, but hard in a different direction. A direction that led, eventually and unevenly and with enormous human cost, toward a world where a child born poor had some chance, however small, of becoming something their grandparents could not have imagined. That is not a justification. It is not an absolution. It is simply the truth, in all its unbearable complexity. Stand in Manchester today. Walk the streets where the mills once stood. The smoke is gone, and the looms are silent. The children are in school. But if you know what happened here, if you know what the ground beneath your feet once witnessed, you can still feel it. The weight of it, the cost of it. Progress always has a price. We are still deciding whether it was worth paying, and maybe that question is never meant to be answered, only carried.